This is Billy Kay, welcoming you to The Scots Tongue, an archive series on the history of the lead that I wrote back in 1986. Attitudes have changed a lot since then, and most of the presentation back then, for example, was done in English, whereas now I would do it in Scots. In my book, Scots a Mother Tongue, first published in the same year, I described speaking Scots as an activity engaged in by consenting adults in the privacy of their own home. But now, more and more native speakers have come out the house, so to speak, are vaunting about being bilingual and sing it loud they're Scots speakers and they're proud. The readers are Peter Raffin and John Shedden. Programme 2 focuses on the dialect of Fife and is cried Makars to Miners. In the first programme, I spoke about how Anglian settlers established the language we now call Scots in the Borders, away back in the 7th century. Today I'll show how Scots replaced Gaelic as the official language of the court and eventually became the dominant speech of the whole of lowland Scotland. Curiously, the changeover from Gaelic to Scots had a lot to do with the Norman invasion of England and the enormous prestige of the Anglo-Norman culture that flourished there. David I, King of Scots, had a Gaelic-speaking father in Malcolm Canmore and an English mother in Queen Margaret, but the main thrust of his reign was to bring the benefits of the Anglo-Norman culture of the south to Scotland, a policy aided by the granting of Scottish lands to Norman noble families then based in England. This was in the 12th century. By the time of the Wars of Independence in the 14th century, the Normans on this side of the border were thoroughly Scottish in outlook. Robert the Bruce was one of them, and this is the poet John Barbour setting the scene for Bruce's great victory at Bannockburn.
Good King, for outen maar de lie, to morn as soon as ye say die, ordain your hall for the bataille, for doubt of dead we shall not fail. None pain shall refuse it be, till we have made our country free. Freedom is a noble thing. Freedom ma's man to half leaking. Freedom all solace to man gives. He leaves at S that freely leaves. A noble heart my half nanes, na elles noch that my him place, give freedom fail ye.
The strong feeling of national identity expressed in that poem written in the 14th century had evolved in a people who originally came from very different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. For example, when David I founded royal boroughs all over the lowlands as centres of royal power, they were inhabited by Gaels, Flemish, French and English. The Norman French spoken by the nobility left its mark. Most of the old boroughs have street names like Edinburgh's West Port, from La Porte, the gate, or Avenel, from La Venelle, a lane. But far more important to the development of Scots than the Norman nobility were the thousands of ordinary people from the north of England who accompanied them, artisans who established themselves in the melting pot of the boroughs and eventually established their dialect as the lingua franca or everyday speech there. This is what we now call early Scots.
Until the end of the 14th century, Scots and Northern English, not General English, were pretty alike. They weren't as alike as people sometimes say, actually. There were differences. For instance, Scots had already absorbed a lot of Gaelic words, and there were some differences in pronunciation, but broadly they were alike. But again, a divergence set in, and this took place mainly, I think, in the course of the 15th century, which happened to be a time of a kind of spurt of language change in both England and Scotland. So there were changes to be made in pronunciation, and of course this was the coming of the Renaissance and a big outburst of new vocabulary, so there were possible changes in the handling and the selection of new vocabulary, and this was all going on in the absence of a kind of standardising pull from the south, so that Scots and English diverged most of all, I think, in the course of the 15th century. This was a great divide, so to speak.
Jack Aitken of the Dictionary of the Older Scottish Tongue. Much of what we now think of as typically Scots language actually came from what you might call an Anglo-Danish legacy, for those early settlers in the boroughs had originally come from the Danelaw north of the Humber, where the Scandinavians held power for so long and of course exercised a tremendous influence on the language. They gave us kirk for the English church, breeks for breeches, kist for chest, brig for bridge, rig for ridge, loup for leap, ain for own, skirl for shrill. Some of their words survive in Northern English dialects, but many others are only on use in this side of the border. Words like to flit, to host, your graith, your neve, and your lug. Because of the economic power and social prestige of the boroughs, the surrounding population had to learn this language if they wanted a piece of the action, which they most certainly did. The result was that by the end of the 14th century, this language was established all over the lowland area, apart from Galloway, and it had replaced Latin as the official language of state. Here's an example of how it sounded in an Act of General Council from 1397.
In the execution of the whilks arrests, all barons, free haldens, and all other the king's lieges shall help and support the sheriffs and all other officers of the king's at all their poor, as well again their own men and retinues as again other.
Now, although Scots became the dominant language of the kingdom, the other native language, Gaelic, left its mark, with words describing the landscape such as ben, glen, strath and loch. Our word for frost, cranrach, for hearth, ingle, and for comely or hearty, sonsy. These are all from Gaelic. The Flemish settlers gave us the name of one of the national sports, gowf, and even the name for the 19th hole, the howf. The old alliance with France was another source that contributed to Scots' increasingly different vocabulary from English. Go into a butcher's shop south of the border and ask for Yennevi jigget chopes for the ashet and the windy, and you'll see one confused butcher. But jigget from gigot, a lamb, and ashet from assiette, a plate, are common Scots words, as is dinna fash yourself from sifashi, hogmanay, haggis, gardilou, tassie, and a good wheen other words. With the range and scope of the language expanding all the time, it's no surprising that writers emerged to exploit its potential.
His face froncet, his lyre was like the lead, his teeth chatteret and cheveret with the chin, his een droopet, how sunken in his heed, out of his nose the meldrop fast can rin, with lippes blay and cheekes lang and thin, the ice shockles that frae his hair doon hang, was wonder greet, and as a spear as lang. Atour his belt, his lyart lock is lay, feltered unfair, our fret with frost is hoar. His garmund and his guise fu guy of grey, his wideret weed, frae him the wind out wore. A boustier's bow within his hand he bore. Under his girdle a flash of felon flames, feathered with ice and heated with hailstains. Then Jupiter, recht fair and amiable, god of the starnes in the firmament, and nearest to all thing generable, frae his father Saturn far different, with boorly face and brows bricht and brent, upon his head a garland wonder gay, of floor as fair as it had been in May.
Right at the centre of the kingdom in the 15th century was Fife, and in Dunfermline the schoolmaster Robert Henryson was among the greatest exponents of Scots in poetry. That was an extract from his poem The Testament of Cressid, based on the classical legend of Troilus and Cressida. The characteristic dialects of Fife today are directly descended from the language that Henryson put to such good use. Changes may have occurred in the language over the intervening 500 years, but the weather has aye been a talking point. John Doig from Cellardyke in the East Neuk.
This is a place you escape a lot of water again. My father used to say East Neuk lies in a bicht. It means you can come round, he says, an awful lot of times, one goes right across. And I've seen that myself. I've seen often come into Aberdeen, so you've been along there with your fish, say it was your weekend at home or anything of that kind. Leaving Aberdeen, a gale of wind, and when you come round Fife Ness there, it's like she was in different weather. So many spoke alongside the day I kind of had their own when they spoke. You can, what I mean, different by here or together, you know, in Kent, no? They come for some minutes. I can't explain that, right? You can, I mean, a different like kind of voice. But here in Crail, no, they seem to be the same tongue like where here.
What about Cellar Dyke itself? What is it like now compared to where it used to be, living here?
Well, the folks are a little better off now. The folks at the fishing. When we was all young, you can, it was just, we was what you call dragged up. You can, I mean, our mothers didn't hate to give. You can, I mean, no, they were healthy, but you can, there was no money in the at that time. Toys in the herring. I've gone to the butcher's a few times, asked for a bin for to make soup. Well, when they're at the toys, they would hate toys for the fields. Well, when I was at the scale, as you would say, you know when you get to your dinner, it was kale and soup, kale and soup. You see, that was the whole day. And when their name, a dumpling now and again, you know, anything of that kind.
Inland a bit in the Ferman lands of the How of Fife bides Eck Harley for Cooper. It's no just a change for fishing to Ferman.
The tongues is different, is that the east of Fife. That was a good bit different. I was with a foreman out there in the morning, maybe he was east of Fife, and he used to roar in the bottom door at Yoking time. Well, way to go again, son. That's it. You see, you had a lot of that. But my mother's folk come from the Tefmort side up here. My father's folk again. Well, my father, his first 17 years, his life was at Markinch there. And then there were a lot of he was one of 13, there were a lot of them brothers get to the coal pit. And my Uncle Sandy, his eldest brother, was looking after the pit ponies in the Lindsay pit. But these folk I never saw in my life, but I just heard of it. Because we was up here and there were no motor cars and they used to get about.
In the Miners' Institute at Lahore, the West Fife tongue is spoken over the clatter of dominoes chapping in the background. It evolved in an industrial environment, but it took a wheen words for the old agricultural days afore the pits.
Loused, that was you finished. We're about loused. We're about finished.
Did you ever use the expression yoke to get yoke it for getting stirred?
That's it.
Yoking and lousing.
And was that only today with the fact there was horses doing the pit?
Well, it could be, as you say, because a pony had to get yoke it to get started.
Aye. And
that could originate here, but I never heard it that way, but that could have been.
Today we call what the Fifers speak and what Henryson wrote Scots, but it was only really in the 15th century that people started thinking of Scots as a separate language from English. Derek McClure of Aberdeen University explains.
When Scotland was an independent state, of course Scots was an autonomous language. The odd thing is that it was only beginning to be thought of as a language. In the early Middle Ages it was called Ingles. People in Scotland called their Scots, people who didn't speak Gaelic that is of course, called the lowland tongue Ingles, which is just the medieval Scots form of the word English. And but about the time that Scotland was approaching the imminent loss of its independence politically, oddly enough, it was then that people began to be aware of the fact that they were speaking Scots, and they called it Scots, and they began thinking of it as a national language.
The long hostility between Scotland and England had of course been fired by endless wars, so although Scots and English people could read each other's language with comparative ease, the things they said in print about each other were often of a nature that wouldn't encourage further reading. Here, the Scottish author of The Complaint of Scotland, written in 1549, is decidedly anti-English.
There is not twae nations under the firmament that are mair contrar and different frae others, nor is Englishmen and Scottishmen, howbeit that they be within ane isle and neighbours and of ane language. For Englishmen are subtle, and Scottismen are facile. Englishmen are ambitious in prosperity, and Scottismen are human in prosperity. Englishmen are humble when they are subjected by force and violence, and Scottismen are furious when they are violently subjected. Englishmen are cruel when they get victory, and Scottismen are merciful when they get victory. And to conclude, it is unpossible that Scottismen and Englishmen can remain in concord under ane monarch or ane prince, because their natures and conditions are as indifferent as is the nature of sheep and wolves.
Now, although the author of the complaint is anti-English, he refers to England and Scotland as sharing one language. Because they're from the same linguistic roots, they can be seen as dialects of the same language, but politics, not linguistics, often determines whether someone's speech is defined as a dialect or a language. By the end of the 15th century, the Scottish people began to differentiate their tongue from that of England and began calling it Scots instead of English. The two languages were very different by that time, but the main force behind the gradual change of name was political. For Derek McClure, the situation isn't unique to the Scots-English debate, past or present.
Scots is not a national language in the sense that it has not got official recognition. It's not the language of any government. It's not the language of any broadcasting system. It has no official status. To that extent, it's not a language in the sense that Norwegian or Dutch is a language. On the other hand, it's distinctive enough from English to be classifiable as a language. By virtue of that distinctiveness, it is less like English than Danish is like Norwegian. From what I gather, Danish and Norwegian are more similar to each other than Scots to English, and there are other cases like Flemish and Dutch or Czech and Slovak where you have two different speech forms which are classed as different languages, not so much because they are grossly different from each other, but because they're spoken in different countries. Danish and Norwegian are spoken under different flags, but if they were spoken in the same politically unified territory, then presumably they would be classed as dialects of the same language. Scots also has a literature. It has a very long, distinguished literary tradition, which is one of the things that sometimes is taken as a definition of a language. So, by some criteria, Scots is a language. By some criteria, it would not be classed as one. And a very important fact also is that it's not generally regarded as a language. The Scots-speaking population, most of the people who speak it, have the idea that they're not speaking a real language, they're speaking a form of English. This is a mistaken idea. They think they're speaking a mangled or corrupt form of English, which historically, of course, Scots is not. But it is not supported by the attitude of its speakers that it is a language. Its speakers generally don't think of it as one.
If you went for an interview for a job, and you started speaking your ordinary tongue to your prospective employer, you get flung out. Again, so you have to try and speak proper English.
The Lahore man's attitude that only English is proper is hardly surprising, considering the wrong-headed attitude to Scots by the Scottish establishment. Its condemnation of native speech forms in education and its inexcusable neglect of Scottish literature in the schools means inevitably that the majority of Scots speakers nowadays are ignorant about their language's status and pedigree. In the heyday of the language, there was little sign of linguistic nationalism because there was no need for it. Everybody from the king down spoke it, and all the records and laws were written in it. In James V, John the Commonweal, or the Common Man, had a king whom legend has it travelled the land as a gabber lunnyman, or beggar, to see how his subjects lived. The folk tradition is backed up by historians of the day.
If his clothes was onything ornate, he studied never to follow the fashion of the court or bravity of women. Frae pride he was far, and so far, that whatever he saw given to this vice, he was aye in their contraire, and I offended with him. He was a maintainer of justice, an executor of the laws, a defender of the innocent and the poor. Wherethrough he was named commonly by his special nobility, the poor man's king. For the poor oppressed with the potent he helped aye, and the potent not sparing the indigence of the poor and needy, he overthrew, and that with great severity. Although in this severity might I be seen in him a marvellous benignity, whe put not out, albeit he micht, the life of offenders, but sparing their life, either put them in prison, or took a sum of money frae them, that way punishing them.
Now a begging man came o'er yon lea, with money greens and good days to me. Says the funny of charity, will you lodge a beggar man? Multitude. Well, the night was cold and the cal was wet, and in a yon the angle he sat. He threw the mail poke open his back, and I as he ranted and sang, multitude. Now if I were as black as I am white, as the snow that lies on yonder height, I'd dress myself some beggar like, What will you I gang? Multitude. Oh lassie, your father were young. You haina the cant of the begging tongue. You haina the cant of the begging tongue. When me ye canny gang. Multitude. Was then that they twa made up the plot to rise twa hours before the old folk. They canna lay, they slept the lock, and through the fields they ran. Multitude. Off I ga ride, off I ga run, and haste ye find the traitors again. For she'll be brunt, and he'll be slain, the wearyful beggar man. Multitude. And meanwhile far out our young Lee, who snug in a glen her name could see, the twa were muckle, sport and glee, for you chase cut a wang. Multitude. Oh, a beggar, I'll ne'er lodge again. I had a doctor, but in my inn. Oh, woe be a beggar man, she's dead. I dinna ken whence nor where. Multitude. Oh, yonder she's coming, to your bower, and silks and satins with monies afloor. She held up her hand, she blessed the earth, she followed the beggar man. Multitude. 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 Multitude.
The dialects spoken in East Central Scotland today in places like Fife aren't so far removed from the Scots of the 16th century. Jack Aitken.
By the end of the 16th century, there aren't many great differences in pronunciation between the Scots of that time and modern Scots. All the main sound changes, including the one which produces this very characteristic vowel length effect, which is peculiarly Scots. These had all been established by then. There was one or two sound changes still to come, but it wasn't that different. In fact, a 16th century Fifeshire man would have sounded pretty like a present-day Angus man, because Angus dialect is a bit more conservative than Fifeshire dialect.
Although I speak in what you could cry South Angus tongue, it is mutually intelligible. Yon tongue is mutually intelligible to anybody that speaks in any particular dialect of Scotch. The whole thing is anybody for any bit of Scotland can understand anybody else.
Gavin Sprott demonstrating that the Angus tongue is alive and kicking. But the links between past and present can be heard in the words of the Fife miners today. Earlier I mentioned the languages that influenced Scots. Well, they're all represented in the Scots of the miners. The cleek or hook attached to the hutches is from Old English. The rance, a prop, is from French. To red up is from Flemish. And your snibble, for stoping the hutches, and your graith or equipment come into Scots from Norse. Tom Crothers.
Your graith, pick, shovel, a saw, if you were rich enough to buy a saw, and a mash or a mash axe would be like blunt on one side for hammering and sharpened at the other side if you were chipping at trees or anything like that. The shovel, was your main instrument, but the pick, odd, ken, the front of the face, you would take down loose coal, it wouldn't, ken, until you got it hard, and then that shovel, you would take the gum out below the coal, and then a shot firer blew that down, and then you filled it and then secured it.
The click hunter, he was a gaffer, appointed by the coal company, you see. And he was there, his sole purpose was to see that hutches got sent in to the men at the face, and they were a quick return.
I heard another expression used by a snibble.
It was a worky art, a snibbler.
Aye.
It was a worky art. It was usually a young boy first starting in the pit, or very shortly in the pit. And the tubs would come belting out to the pit bottom, very often in a decline, a wee bit of a bray, you see. And this boy could stand 4 feet away and get this. throw them in, right away, at the bogey wheels, and stop
To stop it. It was to stop it. What was it crying again?
A snibble.
Snibble.
But the usual snibble was made of iron, and if you were shoving the tub and you were going down an incline, it was going too hard, you put this into the strut. And depending on the incline, you maybe use 1 or 2 snibbles.
Aye.
If the incline was steep,
Just
you
to
maybe use
steady
2.
Steady them down the grade so they wouldn't run away.
See, you'd how took the coal. What did you do then when you were ready to, when it was lousing time, you were ready to get home?
You had to clean your own ground.
Red up really means to clean up. Everything ready for the next shift coming on.
I see.
Red up your place. If a man was stripping coal, he usually red up his place before he went home.
Aye.
You see?
Aye.
Ready for the next shift coming on.
Was that a word you'd only use doing the pit, or would you use that in the house?
You use it here even we're talking here about snibbles for a wee while there. I use it sometimes when I'm playing cards here in the old man's shelter. I say, I've got you snibbled.
Aye.
And the boys like it. What was meaning?
Aye.
I got them stopped.
It's surely ironic that words borrowed from the major tongues of Europe can be regarded by some as uncouth just because they're part of the Scots language. Although Scots speakers may not know the exact nature of their tongue's history, they're all aware of the forces against it. Where it's just the change in the way of life that renders mining terms obsolete to non-miners, it's accepted as a natural process. But Scots speakers are also aware that the tongue is being eroded because of the establishment's traditional refusal to recognise its worth. Having a feel for what is literally their mother tongue, this is the force that's resented, a resentment tempered with what most people feel is the inevitability of the process.
We use them in here regular, in a place like this. But the younger generation didn't care what you're talking about, you see.
Aye.
The pits that were all here, there were a pit in every village here at one time, and they're not in now.
Aye.
See? So it's grown out. I've
Aye.
seen me using words like that to my grandchildren.
Aye.
And they stand and look at you, oh, you're an old square or something like that, they'll say, you see?
Aye.
They haven't a clue. Just like the Gaelic. The Gaelic's the very same, you know. We'd all like to see Gaelic prosper and all the rest of that, but I do, it's a lost cause, that's my opinion anyway, just the same as the things you talk about in the pit. It's going to fade out.
And what about the likes of, say, your grand Waynes? Although they don't have their expressions that were to do with the pit, what do they speak nowadays? Do they still speak Fife?
No, I wouldn't say so. On a small scale, you can, but they're more Anglified, if you'd like to put it that way. And this gets up my back anyway, you know, when you hear them saying some of the English expressions.
Aye.
Being Scottish, you sort of rue it. You didn't like to hear them say that, but that's the way life.